Now that I have the drawing more or less sketched in, it's time to start rendering. This obviously a little bit easier than drawing the perspective lines. Um, Here's the general principle for shading any landscape. Work big to large, background to foreground. So let's think about what the largest element is in our composition. We've got lots of different values, but the sky. My advice is to hit the sky first. Notice that our sky is not pure white. Obviously not. We've got some brighter values in our two towers, a few other spots here and there. And that the sky has some kind of value transition. It goes darker here and a little bit lighter towards the horizon. But even at its lightest part, here, the horizon doesn't go nearly as bright as any of the values here. And since the values here aren't pure white either, we have to knock the sky down pretty dark in order to approximate the values that we're seeing. So this is the first step. Let's knock in the sky. Let's block in the sky. We're going to start darker towards the top. Make sure your pencils are sharpened correctly. We've got a big drawing, got a lot of coverage, a lot of area to cover. We're going to start doing something like this. And using our chamois to soften this, to blend it. So that's going to be step one. I'm going to speed this up so you guys can see how this is done at 4 times the speed and not fall asleep while watching this. Now that we started shading the drawing, we need to talk about something called atmospheric perspective. What is atmospheric perspective? Well, it has nothing to do with linear perspective, but it does relate to space. It's a very simple principle that states the further something gets away from you, the more something is in the distance, the less contrast it has, the more grayed out it is. Why does this happen? Because air is impure. It's full of dust, water vapor, which little by little blocks your vision, prevents you from seeing the object clearly at greater and greater distances. So what does this mean? It means that the very darkest darks towards the foreground are going to be a little bit darker than the darkest darks on an object that's a little further away. The darkest darks on this object are going to be a little bit darker than the darkest darks on this object. The darker darks here are going to be a little bit darker than the objects here. And then your lightest contrast, the weakest contrast, is going to be on things that are really, really far away, way off in the distance. Now, here's the problem. Quite often when you're looking at a photograph, you don't see atmospheric perspective because a photograph has a tendency to simplify values and color, but mostly value, particularly in the very darks and the very lights. So a photograph will tell you that a dark here is equally dark to a dark here, that a dark here is equally dark to a dark here, and that the darks here are the same value as the darks that are really, really close. If you draw the image exactly as you see it in the photograph, you're going to get something that looks really, really flat. So quite often, particularly when you're working from a photograph, no matter how good it is, you have to put in what the photograph simplified, what the photograph left out. And by the way, this often happens in observational drawing as well. Let's say you're out in the high desert and the atmosphere is very, very clear. There's not a lot of dust, not a lot of water vapor. Things that are really far away are going to appear as dark, as crisp as things that are close. And it's up to you as the artist to reinforce the sense of atmospheric perspective into the drawing. So you're going to look at this, but when you draw it, you're going to draw something more like this. All right, so I've adjusted this with a little bit of Photoshop Paint. Can you see that this image has a little bit more depth to it? Basically, I've introduced layers of haze to this image so that things that are further away are hazier, a little bit lighter, a little bit softer than things that are closer. So basically, try to introduce haze into your drawing. Try to make the air dirtier, more polluted in your drawing, because that reinforces the sense of depth. You can see that here we still have depth because of perspective, because of overlapping shapes, but the second image that's been adjusted has a stronger sense of atmospheric perspective. Keep that in mind, because really, even if the drawing is perfectly accurate in terms of linear perspective, if it's inaccurate in terms of atmospheric perspective, it'll fail. It'll fail because our depth will not be convincing. Conversely, if the drawing has some weak spots in terms of linear perspective, but is really consistent and accurate in terms of atmospheric perspective, that can still be a convincing drawing. Because no one's going to take a ruler to your drawing to go, aha, the vanishing points are not in the same spot. However, everybody has an instinct when it comes to depth. Everybody knows what something that's far away looks like. Right? We have a sense, we have immediate understanding of what's close and what's further away based on this principle, the principle of atmospheric perspective. So be really faithful to it and then reinforce it in your drawing. Okay, now that the sky is blocked in, I'm going to start working a little more towards the foreground, right? A little bit closer, and start rendering out the buildings back here and the tower here. Let's start doing that. So this building is a little bit in shadow. I'm trying not to go into detail. I'm trying to block in the shapes as much as possible. So it goes a little bit lighter here. We've got a little shadow underneath the roof. We've got a window here. I'm going to put down the value, and then I'm going to move it around with a blending stump. Try to avoid detail at this stage. Again, we're working big to small, general to specific. Don't put in your textures yet. Just block in the general values that you're seeing as much as possible. Got some mountains back here. We've got lots of really interesting textures. Don't let them seduce you yet. Don't start throwing yourself in the texture quite yet. It is seductive. Alright, now that this building is sketched in, we're going to start moving forward. Let's start dealing with our tower and some of our trees. So notice that this tree is almost entirely in silhouette. What I'm going to do here is just block in the general shape like this and get it down to the general level of darkness. Anytime you have a dark object, the first step is to get the general local value. That's all I'm doing right now. Generalizing, getting the general value of this tree. Alright, now let's deal with the tower. It's lighter here, darker here. Let's start blocking in our general values. Now, there might be a tendency, as you're shading, to lose some of the detail. Right? So if you see that the detail is starting to get lost, reinforce it. So I'm not sure if you guys can see this, but I'm in danger of losing my arches. Before that happens, I'm going to go back in and reinforce my drawing a little bit so that it doesn't get lost. So this is really the only time I go back to being specific, is if some of the details start getting lost in my rendering. So you can go back in and reinforce it before it gets lost completely. Don't let it get lost. It's going to be a lot of work getting it back again. Right? You're going to have to go back with your ruler. And look, sometimes we will have to go back to the ruler, right? Towards the end of the drawing, if we need to sharpen up some of the lines. So for instance, this kind of stuff, right? Okay, so I'm going for the general value right now. I notice that it's a little bit darker towards the front edge. Going this way, this tree is going a little bit darker. Okay, I'm not too worried about getting the specific shape of the tree. Right now I'm just kind of blocking in the general shape of it and approximating the value. Alright, let's keep going. We've got a cylindrical object here. It's lit almost exactly from the side, this way, like this. And then we have a light break that runs this way, like this. Then we have a cast shadow that runs like this. Then we have cast shadows running this way, running across, running down. Okay, so I'm going to work on the background a little bit here and here and here. I'm going to speed this up so I don't put you to sleep. And then when I'm done with this, we'll deal with the larger tower and some of the foreground trees. As I'm working little by little towards the foreground, I'm going to start increasing the contrast in my drawing because of atmospheric perspective. So we have some trees here. I noticed that they're a little bit lighter on this side, a little bit darker on this side. Right? I'm going to start putting in the general form of my tree. If you guys remember, anytime we're dealing with a really strong texture, the first thing you want to do is get the local value, the general value of the object. And then we're going to simplify the light break. So we're not going to get too specific about it. We're just going to find the general shape of this tree. As I start going closer and closer, right? These trees are coming closer and closer and closer. I'm going to make the shadow value darker and darker and darker. I'm going to increase the contrast. That is the main principle of atmospheric perspective. That is something that I'm trying to reinforce. The dark here, again, I'm being blocked by the easel a little bit hard to see. The dark here needs to be a little bit lighter than the dark here. The dark here needs to be a little bit darker than the very darkest value here. So we're dealing with a tree that is pretty close to us, almost near the foreground. It's almost entirely in silhouette as well. So the darks here are going to go very, 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 very strong. But not as strong as the darks here. So when it comes time to blocking in the value of, I guess this is a pool now that I'm looking at it more closely. I didn't quite see the top of it. I'm going to increase the contrast here as I'm blocking in the value to emphasize the sense of closeness. Now, this isn't even the very darkest value on this area, right? I'm going to start going darker once I start putting in the texture. Again, I'm averaging things out. That's really, really important. Do not throw yourself into detailing before you've done the block-in stage. Now notice, I haven't even done any erasing yet, right? Use a blending stump here. By the way, you can always use a paper towel. This one has some ink on it, but should be all right. See, Paper Towel does a very, very good job of blending values, particularly when they start getting big. You should start to be able to see depth develop in this stage. Let's start piling on the darks a little bit. Remember to work in values, particularly if you're working with soft charcoal. Pressing down is going to flatten the paper and decrease the chance you're going to be able to go darker. So build up your values little by little. One wash, another wash, another wash. Now, I'm going to admit this to you. I'm not using a charcoal pencil. I'm using a carbon pencil. Carbon pencils are a little bit stickier. They're a little bit better for detail. But feel free to use a carbon pencil. This is something I'm going to tell all of you guys at the beginning, not towards the middle of the demo. So you should be able to start seeing the depth develop little by little. Okay, so now let's block in our wall. We have a wall here, a brick wall. It's going dark. And now we're going to hit just about the most complicated area in the composition, this tower. Now, in order for me to do that, I need to lean in a little bit, which is going to block the camera. So I'm going to do that off camera for you guys. And then when we come back, we'll start putting in the details and talk about how to render texture in landscape.